Why, hello everybody, it's Histor-Tea time! Welcome back to another episode of Histor-Tea time with your favorite historian and her favorite tea. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the Battle of Midway. Now, the Battle of Midway is so cool because there's so many things that honestly went horribly wrong and yet somehow went amazingly right. It's crazy how that worked. And it's such a small point in history, but it's also such a big point too, because so many little things caused it and also caused it to go very, very well in some ways. So, let's talk about what led up to the Battle of Midway. We're going to talk about the Pacific Fleet first. So we know that Admiral Kimmel, who totally failed us with Pearl Harbor, okay, he was now out of his position of authority. So, sip on that tea. And then Charles Nimitz was then put in charge of the Pacific Fleet, which is awesome. So he was actually a pretty good person to work for, according to a lot of the soldiers at the time, a lot of the sailors at the time. They said that he was very good with morale, he listened to everybody, he was very approachable, so he's a good guy to have in charge. On the Japanese side, we still have Admiral Yamamoto. Remember him? He was the guy from Pearl Harbor. He launched that massive attack. It was pretty intense. It was very terrible. Oh my god. Now, Nimitz went to D.C., and the FDR administration told him to not return until the War in the Pacific Theater was won. So he really didn't have much of a choice except to attack. Now, Nimitz was known to be a really good commander to serve under and work with, which is awesome, like I said. And Admiral Yamamoto's fears were finally becoming real when his point that he made to the Japanese when they attacked Pearl Harbor was ignored. So he knew that if they didn't take out the U.S. Pacific Carrier Fleet, the U.S. would come with a massive vengeance. And that's exactly what the U.S. was planning to do. Now, making the next move. So Yamamoto now had his evidence, right? The Japanese knew now that the Pacific Fleet was getting ready to attack. They were making battle plans, okay? And now that Yamamoto has his evidence, he knew that he needed to come up with a new plan to take out the U.S. Pacific Carrier Fleet. So Yamamoto plans to lure the U.S. carrier fleet out of Pearl Harbor for a naval battle to annihilate their fleet. The lure point was going to be Midway, and this is an island out in the middle of the Pacific. It's actually known as an atoll. You should go Google that. Haha. Okay, sorry. But it was a huge U.S. refueling station, so it was a big, it really is the Midway, between, the United States and then Asian territories. Now, you ready for the first one? Hallowed historical moment. Off the coast of Allied-held Guinea territory, the U.S. carriers Lexington and Yorktown, those are the names of two U.S. carriers, were by themselves. This is half of the entire carrier fleet. There are only 4 carriers that make up the U.S. naval fleet at the time, at least the carrier portion. There are only 4 carriers, okay? Yamamoto sees his opportunity since Japan had 5 carriers full of Zeros, which were Japanese aircrafts. They were very, very high-grade aircrafts. And they knew that with this amount of force, they could actually take out half of the entire carrier fleet. That's insane. But he sees this opportunity, and he takes it. So Yamamoto's forces, they take out the Lexington and Yorktown. So now half of the entire naval fleet is destroyed. Japan's plans were finally coming together once again, and the U.S. is also once again crumbling under the Japanese military forces. This is very bad. So let me put this all into perspective for you. Allied territory, the U.S. carriers were out there diffusing some issues. There were 2 carriers out there at the time that belonged to the U.S. Carrier fleet. Now, the carrier fleet and then the entire Navy are 2 different things. Okay, they're part of the Navy, but aircraft carriers are a new type of thing, okay? Aircraft carriers are like floating cities. The best way to think of this, one, you can just Google it if you don't know what it is. Also, if you've ever seen the Avengers, it's kind of what they're all on. It's called the helicarrier, and then it goes into the sky. So anyway, if you ever watched that movie, you can kind of sort of see what an aircraft carrier would look like. But anyway, so Yamamoto, while he's planning to lure the entire Pacific Fleet to Midway, he then sees an opportunity to take out half of them, completely annihilate them when they're over there in Guinea, because it's very close to Japan. So he's like, go ahead, go down there, destroy 2 of those ships. And then there you go, 2 out of 4 are down. So that's what just happened. However, maybe not all hope is lost. In Hawaii, the hypocryptography unit. Now, fun fact about Miss Mullins, your favorite historian, I actually know about cryptography, and I took an entire cryptography course, and I learned a little bit about how they did cryptoanalyzation during World War II, and I learned about the different code machines and how they used various code breaking techniques. So this is actually really cool. So the hypocryptography unit was attempting to decipher Japanese radio messages, and this whole unit was led by Captain Joseph Rochefort, who actually spent years in Japan learning the language and their culture. According to a lot of sources, he was pretty eccentric and not very respected because he was kind of, marching to the beat of his own drummer. But the best way to describe him would be, think of Mulder from The X-Files. He's like the unconventional genius. So anyway, all right, ready? Next one, hallowed historical moment. May 1942, Rochefort picks up several Japanese radio messages about operations against a target codenamed AF. AF is important. Rochefort remembers way back in March of 1942 when he intercepted a Japanese message from a scout pilot saying that he was passing area AF. And by the timing of his flight path, he's using a map, he's using all this stuff. Rochefort actually deduces that AF must mean Midway. Again, he's not, if you look at this, he doesn't technically have a whole lot of evidence. This is kind of just a hunch, and just by listening and knowing where the Japanese scout pilot was, approximately, not completely, but approximately, he can guess that it has to be Midway. So this guy is Rochefort right here, and this is Nimitz. We like them. They're very good. You know how a lot of the times people build up the idea of like the intelligence forces in the military? Okay, the Battle of Midway was pretty much dependent on the fact that we had the intelligence forces at the time. Without the hypocryptography unit, we would have totally missed Midway, and we would have again been demolished. So here we go. Now this is Midway right here. So Pearl Harbor is here. All right, we're here. This is where the battle is going to take place. And as you can see, it literally is in the middle between the United States territory and Japan. Alright, but naturally, like all unconventional geniuses, nobody believed him. So Rochefort submits a report to DC, and they actually dismiss it because they say that he doesn't have enough evidence, and they don't want to send out the remaining fleet all the way to Midway to be wrong. Do it again. Hallowed historical moment. Rochefort used a back channel and then contacted Nimitz, who is in charge of the Pacific Fleet now. Okay, so he explained what he believes to be an oncoming attack. Now Nimitz, being the good guy that he was, actually listens, but he says that they need to be sure because it is a big risk to take if you're wrong. Again, moving your entire fleet out in the middle of the Pacific, moving it further away from everybody else, is a big gamble to do. It's not a very smart decision unless you're sure. So Nimitz and Rochefort actually assemble an entire radio team, and they created a fake transmission from Midway, saying that the island's water system is broken and that they're low on water. Now remember, this is fake, okay? What they did, essentially, is they had created a fake radio transmission saying, hey, U.S., the mainland, Midway is low on water, okay? Our system is broken. It was not real, it was a test. And what they did, their team watched the radio messaging systems. And then later that day, at around in the afternoon, Rochefort and Nimitz's team intercepts a radio message from the Japanese communications that AF is low on water. So this is the evidence that they needed. It's amazing. It's crazy that this worked. It's crazy that this is how we knew, okay? So Rochefort had everything, Nimitz had everything, so he realizes that they pretty much only have 2 carriers and they need to have more to have a fighting chance. Thankfully, at Guinea, the Lexington and Yorktown, remember Lexington was totally destroyed, but Yorktown wasn't totally demolished, and the Japanese thought that it was, but it actually wasn't. Somehow it was salvaged, and it was completely repaired in 3 days. Now I wanna elaborate a little bit here. An aircraft carrier is huge. It's not like a little fishing ship. It's big. So to repair something and make it battle ready in 3 days is no easy feat. The repair team actually told Nimitz that it was going to take him 6 months. Nimitz says, you have 3 days to make a battle ready. That's it. And somehow, by the grace of God, it was. Now, Nimitz brings 3 carriers towards Pearl Harbor and then hides the fleet so they can pretty much kind of, also try to lure. They're going to use the Japanese tactic against them to lure the Japanese fleet closer to Midway. Now that they know it's Midway, they're going to lure them there early. Okay? So on the 4th of June, 1942, hallowed historical moment, Japanese carrier fleet is approaching Midway under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. Now, this characteristic is actually very important. He's very by the book. Pretty much saying, if it's not in the manual, we ain't gonna do it. That's pretty much how Nagumo is. They initiate the attack on Midway by sending a swarm of Japanese planes to bomb Midway. Now, there's actually, there's barely any footage that survived Midway, but thankfully, we have some. The renowned film director John Ford at the time was actually stationed at Midway and captured the only footage that survived the attack. Every other camera at the time was either destroyed, footage was melted, caught on fire, whatever. But thankfully, John Ford's film survived. So we do have that, which I can show you later. So, spaghetti. I'm sorry. As you can tell, I got very, very animated when I was making this PowerPoints, and I had a lot of caffeine. So as Japanese planes are bombing Midway, they notice something very important. The U.S. air bomber planes are nowhere to be seen. They were supposed to be there, and they weren't. So earlier that morning, Ford's cameras actually caught footage of the U.S. bomber planes taking off. So the bomber planes that the U.S. was using was the B-17 bombers, and they actually appear overhead the Japanese airplanes. So as the Japanese planes, let me just paint this picture for you. The Japanese are bombing Midway. It's terrible. Well, then they're looking and they're flying. They're like, where are all the U.S. bomber planes? They're supposed to take everything out. Well, then the U.S. appear right overhead and they start dropping bombs, okay? And they nearly kill Nagumo, who was out in the ocean on his carrier. And the Japanese planes were actually rigged with naval weapons specifically geared to attack naval vessels, which is what they planned on doing to the U.S., okay? So this was a problem. So they're trying to bomb the island with torpedo bombing, in the water. They're also trying to bomb all these ships because the whole plan was to lure the U.S. fleet out there. Well, the fleet isn't anywhere to be found, so it's a problem. And so what happens? Nagumo decides to tell his planes to come back, okay? And he orders everyone to come back to the carriers and say, okay, you need to switch from naval attack weapons to land attack weapons, because that's who we're going to go against now. However, there's a problem. This whole transition takes like 2 hours, which is pretty crucial in a battle. Time, every second counts. A lot of attacks, if you pretty much don't have the upper hand within the first 15 minutes, you're going to lose it. Now, things can turn, obviously. It has happened, and it is possible. But if you can only use your forces that you've got right there in that situation, this is just coming from someone that's actually had to look and study battle plans as, an officer in the military. Let me tell you, it's crucial to have the upper hand as early on as possible. You don't want to go in underhanded. You don't want to go in thinking, well, this might happen and then we could lose. You always want a contingency plan that guarantees your success. Stepping back. Okay, so a Japanese scout plane reports that a U.S. naval vessel is 30 minutes, or 30 minutes after Nagumo said to ground all airplanes and convert their weapons, which would take 2 hours. So this is bad. So a Japanese scout plane essentially says, hey Nagumo, I see U.S. naval vessels sitting out in the water off the coast of Midway. We got a problem. And Nagumo had already grounded his planes. So he's like, what do I do? Squadrons of U.S. dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighter planes they are rushing to defend the bombers, or their own, okay, so let me restate that. So fighter planes are to defend the torpedo and the dive bombers. Okay, so that way that when the Japanese try to shoot the dive bombers down, because the dive bombers have to get very low, they can defend them and shoot the other planes down. Okay. Really quick, I'm gonna kind of interrupt my own video real quick. So one thing I kind of wanted to show you guys, don't judge me for my drawing skills, but I'm gonna show you kind of like what the dive bombers had to do. So take a look. All right. This is essentially what they're gonna do. And do not tell me that my plane looks like a shark. I know it does. Don't judge me. So this is representing a U.S. dive bomber. This is a Japanese ship. Okay. So what the dive bomber had to do, they had to go into a roll essentially and go at an 80-degree angle downward, and then drop the bombs, right? And then they'll hit the ship, and then right around towards the end of the ship, mind you, they're getting pretty low. Okay. And then they would pull up and then go out. So that kind of training was insane, and many of them it took like a year to perfect. So nothing but respect for the training that the pilots had to do for being dive bombers. All right, enjoy. So they were instructed to find the Japanese fleet, but they were actually pretty far off from the fleet. So that's a problem. So if you think about it, the Japanese see the U.S. naval fleet sitting out there and they get scared. And Nagumo was like, oh my god, I don't know what to do. The U.S. fleet wasn't supposed to be that way. we were supposed to have the upper hand. We were supposed to surprise them, but now they're going to surprise attack us. But in a way, the U.S. kind of spoiled their chances of surprise because their lack of good communication sent a bunch of squadrons in different directions. So they weren't anywhere near the Japanese fleet. And here's, again, where this quality is kind of important. Nagumo notices that he has planes that haven't been converted to land attack weapons yet, so he could technically send those out to attack the U.S. ship that was spotted, but the Japanese military doctrine states that you cannot attack unless you have a fully coordinated group of planes to ensure maximum damage to the enemy. So this is what he does. He orders the switch to be reversed. So essentially, all recently converted land attack weaponry is then to be switched back to naval attack weaponry. This adds another 2 hours. So we have 4 hours of Japanese forces just sitting on their aircraft carriers, repairing their planes, and moving and shifting all the weaponry, and redoing and rewiring everything. 4 hours of them not being in the air, giving us time. But again, we have a problem. The United States squadrons, they were not coordinating correctly, so they actually went separate directions and could not locate the Japanese fleet. Meanwhile, the U.S. torpedo pilots were facing off Japanese Zeros, and they were obliterated. So the U.S. torpedo pilots were sent off from another aircraft carrier, and they were sent to go then bomb the visible Japanese fleet. Okay. From the first wave of the U.S. squadrons, only 1 pilot returned. And then from the next 2 waves, the U.S. torpedo squadrons were massacred, and only 4 planes in total survived that entire first attack. Out of all, the first 3 waves, only 4 planes came back. There's a lot of planes that make up squadrons, and only 4 came back. That's really, really bad. Alright, you ready? U.S. dive bombers to the rescue. Hallowed historical moment. So at 10:30 a.m. on the 4th of June, 1942, by what totally seems to be a stroke of luck, the separated U.S. dive bombers come together and follow the wake of a Japanese destroyer ship, which actually leads them to the entire Japanese fleet. So what happens is, let me set this scene for you. Picture it. Out in the Pacific, 1942. June. The U.S. dive bombers are flying out in the Pacific, and they're pretty much flying pretty far out. They know that they really can't go any further because they're like, if we go any further, we're gonna lose fuel. We're gonna completely crash in the ocean. We can't do that. So we need to turn back. And then as they're gonna turn back, by chance they happen to spot a Japanese destroyer ship. And so what they do is they follow the wake of it. So essentially, it's like a trail that the ship leaves in the water. And so they follow that and they stay, you know, far enough back to where someone from the Japanese ship doesn't say anything and they can't see them. And then as they do that, they happen to come up on the entire Japanese fleet. That's crazy. So the Japanese Zero fighter planes are nowhere in sight because one, no one was talking about it, and they were grounded after fighting the U.S. torpedo squadrons. So there was nothing to stop the U.S. dive bombers. Literally, the Japanese Air Force, the Japanese Navy, their fleet, nothing. No one was aware of this insane attack getting ready to happen. So in just 5 minutes, the U.S. dive bombers destroy 3 out of 4 of the Japanese carrier fleet. The Zero fighter planes are forced to land in the sea because their carrier ships are completely destroyed. So they now have nowhere to land. So they're just kind of going into the water. And the Japanese try to launch one more mission, but it's like a suicide mission at this point. And the U.S. dive bombers destroy the last remaining carrier ship. So now all 4 Japanese carrier fleets are completely destroyed. So essentially, what the Japanese try to do to us, we did to them. So the U.S. scores a huge victory. Admiral Yamamoto was devastated because his entire fleet was destroyed, okay? 3,000 Japanese and Americans were killed in just one day. That's insane. That's crazy. It's so sad to know that so many lives were cost in such a short amount of time. I mean, any amount of time is terrible, but, you know, it's a fact, you know, that it was a very quick attack. It was very quick, and it was insane how, like I said, a stroke of luck. All these things just happened in a row, and they just kept cycling through. It's crazy. Now, Yamamoto was actually hunted down by U.S. fighter pilots and then assassinated. Nagumo faced another humiliating loss over in Saipan, and he then kills himself out of shame. So the Battle of Midway was won by the U.S., and quite honestly, thanks to the sheer perseverance of Captain Rochefort and also efforts from the intelligence forces that he had supporting him, and then the pilots who died and served on that day, and thanks to Admiral Nimitz for being willing to listen, because DC, all the administration of FDR, everybody up there shut him down. They were like, nope, not going to listen. But Nimitz, thank God, was very kind and was just like, yeah, let's talk. And he was like, whoa, you're smart. So yeah, very interesting. So this is some pictures, or these are some pictures from, I know I can grammar, I know it, of the attack that day. So these are the the US B-17 bombers. So let's watch some amazing footage, and unlike I did last time, I didn't prepare this, so you're gonna have to sit with me as we wait for the link to load and everything. This should be good. And this footage is provided to us by Military Public Domain. This is from the National Archives and Records Administration, so yay! Alright, so we're going to see some footage. This is some of the only footage that survived from Midway. So, and it was perfectly restored to color. So please, we're not going to watch the whole thing, obviously, but I'm going to show you some key points. These are the planes that scrambled off the runway for the attack that morning that Ford caught.
Suddenly, from behind the clouds, the Japs attacked.
They're like totally missing the planes. It's terrible. Okay, so here we go. This is the footage from John Ford's cameras on the island. Everything's on fire, everything's getting bombed, but the planes are nowhere in sight, so these hangars are empty, essentially. So it's a good thing. Oh my god. That's insane that this footage survived. Everyone's like scrambling. Wow. I mean, people died. Don't get me wrong. The attack on Midway while I didn't touch on it for a very long amount of time, there were victims on the island too. But I will say that the majority of the deaths were pilots, and the torpedo pilots were, it was very sad at the overwhelming rate at how many of them died. Again, only 4 planes came back. 1 pilot survived the first attack. The torpedo pilots were so severely underarmed because they didn't know what they were going up against. And they were also newly trained pilots. They were all trained, post Pearl Harbor. So, whereas these Zero pilots were, on the Japanese side, were veteran pilots, they were very skilled. They were easily able to maneuver everywhere. So, it was devastating. Look at that. Everything's just incinerated. Oh yes, here we go. So, these are the torpedo and dive bombers at the time for the US. And I believe that, I don't know if that's Japanese or if that's, we're gonna find out. Is he gonna drop a bomb on it? He's getting ready.
The trap is sprung.
Oh my god, he's so
Planes
close.
fought from the decks of our carriers, army bombers, marines, under destruction over a 300-mile battle area.
It's a big battle area. Oh my god, that's insane. Can you imagine that? Wow. Obviously, those are the Americans shooting out Japanese fighters. But, so thank you again to Military Public Domain. This is not my footage. Thank you to them for allowing me to use it. But anyway, so I hope that you enjoyed this segment of Histor-Tea time with your favorite historian.